The sun had barely risen over the wide plains when the sound of wagon wheels creaked along the dusty road leading into the little village. Morning light spilled across the rooftops of weather-beaten buildings' wooden shops with faded signs. A church steeple reaching upward and a livery stable where tired horses pawed at the earth. The late 1800s was no easy time, and in this corner of America, life depended on hard work, grit, and the mercy of neighbors. Folks here carried themselves with quiet dignity, bound by survival and the land that gave both hardship and hope. At the edge of town, beyond the blacksmith's clang and the chatter of early risers, a small wagon came to a halt. A woman climbed down, her dress plain but clean, her bonnet shielding her face from the brightness of day. She held the hand of a little boy, no more than 6, his eyes wide with both curiosity and worry. Their belongings were modest, tucked neatly into the wagon bed, just enough to suggest a life left behind. With no promise of what lay ahead, she had traveled miles with little more than courage. And her journey had ended here, in front of a sprawling ranch whose white-painted gate looked more like a barrier to another world than a welcome. The land stretched far as the eye could see, rolling fields, cattle grazing in the distance, and a big house that stood proud against the horizon. Everything about it spoke of wealth and security, a sharp contrast to the woman's own life of scraping by. She paused at the gate, her boy clutching her skirts. The moment held a weight heavier than the dust on her boots. To knock, to ask, to step forward, it meant swallowing pride, admitting need. Yet she knew she could not turn back. There was no other road, no other chance. Inside the house, the rancher rose from his table. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of labor, though time and fortune had placed him above most men in the county. He was known for his sternness, a man who gave orders more often than he asked questions, and whose land stretched farther than most dared to ride in a day. Folks in the village respected him, though few felt close enough to call him friend. He lived with his household staff, ranch hands, and kin, running his property with discipline. Yet beneath the hardened look he carried, there was a silence in his home that lingered longer than it should. When the knock came at his gate that morning, it startled more than just the dogs, stirred a curiosity, as though fate had come calling. The woman's voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she asked the question that had carried her. "Across miles of unforgiving land, I've come looking for work. Will you let me earn a place?" Her words fell into the quiet air like stones breaking still water. For a long moment, the rancher simply looked at her, the lines on his face unreadable. His eyes flickered from the woman to the boy, then back again. He had seen wanderers before, drifters hoping to catch a bit of luck. But something in her voice, something unbroken, despite the hardship written in her clothes and weary stance, gave him pause. The rancher's gaze drifted toward the house, where windows stood open and the scent of the morning fire carried out. His home had seen many meals cooked by hired help, but always temporary, always passing through. Here was a woman who was not just asking for coin, but for the right to stay, to belong. "Can you cook?" His voice was even, though a hint of something deeper tugged beneath it. The woman nodded once, her boy pressing closer to her side. "I can, and more, if you'll allow me." The words hung heavy between them. To invite her in was no small thing. A stranger could bring trouble, yet she seemed anything but dangerous. She was desperate, yes, but there was strength in the way she stood, as if she'd braved more storms than she cared to name. The rancher shifted, his boots pressing into the dust, his eyes still measuring her as though the decision would shape more than the day, might shape the whole course of both their lives. Behind them, the village stirred, neighbors beginning to glance their way, curious about the lone woman and child at the richest man's gate. Whispers would soon ripple through town, and the story of her arrival would not stay secret long. The rancher's next words would either close the door to her hopes, or open a path neither could yet see. He leaned a little closer, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of both authority and something she hadn't expected: hesitation. "Will you cook for us and stay?" The boy's hand tightened around his mother's. Her breath caught. And for a moment, the world seemed to still. This was more than an offer of wages. It was an invitation into a life, one filled with uncertainty. One she had not dared imagine when she set out on this road. Yet before she could answer, the creak of the gate, the restless shift of horses nearby, and the sharp eyes of townsfolk watching from a distance all pressed in on the moment, turning it fragile as glass. And in that silence, caught between the need for shelter and the risk of stepping into another man's world, the story truly began. The woman's heart pounded as she stood there. The boy pressed close against her skirts, his eyes peeking up at the towering man who had just asked a question that seemed far bigger than the words themselves. The air felt heavy, almost charged, as if the land itself was listening for her answer. She wanted to speak, to accept, but her throat tightened. She could not tell yet if this man was offering her refuge or setting a test she dared not fail. The rancher waited, his expression unreadable, though his gaze never wavered. Behind him, the vast ranch seemed alive with the cattle grazing beyond the fences. The distant bark of dogs, the faint rhythm of hammers where ranch hands repaired a corral. Everything here belonged to him, every inch of land and breath of dust. For her to step through his gate meant stepping into his world entirely. Leaving the little bit of freedom she had left at the roadside, the boy tugged at her hand. "Mama," he whispered, almost too soft for the rancher to hear, "I'm hungry." That small voice seemed to settle something inside her. She straightened her back, nodded once, and said quietly, "If you'll have me, I will stay." Rancher gave no sign of approval beyond a brief tilt of his head. He pushed open the gate, the hinges creaking like a door long unused, and motioned for them to follow. The boy's small feet scrambled on the gravel path, while his mother's steps were slow and steady, though every nerve in her body screamed with uncertainty. The big house came closer, its windows glinting in the sunlight. Up close, it was both beautiful and intimidating: white paint that had weathered storms, wide porches where rocking chairs waited empty, and tall doors that seemed more fitting for a courthouse than a home. The woman wondered how many years had passed since laughter had truly filled those walls. Inside, the air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread. A maid crossed the hallway with a stack of linens, pausing briefly to study the newcomers before disappearing without a word. Somewhere deeper in the house, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices hinted at a household already in motion. It was not silence that ruled here, but a sort of order, every sound in its place, every movement deliberate. The rancher stopped in the wide kitchen, where copper pots gleamed on hooks and a long wooden table stretched across the floor. He gestured toward the hearth. "This is where you'll prove your words," he said simply. "Meals, 3 a day, for the house and for the hands when they're working close. It's no small task." She nodded. "I've managed before." He studied her a moment longer, and the boy. Her hand instinctively tightened around her son's shoulder. "He stays with me. He'll learn to work when he's able. For now, I'll keep him out of the way." Something flickered in the rancher's eyes, though he gave no answer beyond another brief nod. He turned to leave, but stopped in the doorway. "There are rules here. You'll come to know them soon enough. Break them, and you won't last." The words chilled her, though she only gave another quiet nod. When he was gone, the woman exhaled slowly, the boy leaning into her side. She scanned the room, the shelves heavy with jars, sacks of flour stacked against the wall, and a stove that looked far larger than the one she'd known back in her little cottage. Everything here was more than she was used to, yet it was also overwhelming. She was not just cooking for herself anymore. She was stepping into a place where every mistake would be noticed by noon. She had set to work, kneading dough with flour-dusted hands while her boy sat quietly near the table watching. Every sound echoed louder than it should have: the thump of dough, the scrape of a chair, the hiss of the fire. The weight of being watched even unseen pressed on her shoulders. She felt the eyes of the house, the judgment of strangers. Though no one lingered, it was later when she carried fresh bread to the dining table that she saw the rancher again. He sat at the head, a place that suited him too well. While several men ranch hands by their rugged clothes and weathered skin took places along the sides. The maid served stew, but all eyes shifted when the woman entered. Her bread, golden and steaming, was set down. One of the men smirked. "New cook, is she? Let's hope she can last longer than the last." The rancher's gaze cut sharply toward him, silencing further jest. The room fell into a quiet tension as the men tore into the bread. They ate in silence, but she felt the weight of their judgment in every crumb. When the rancher finally broke his piece and tasted it, his face remained as unreadable as before. But he ate more, and that alone was a kind of answer. That night, when the boy lay curled up on the small cot the maid had prepared for them in a side room, the woman sat awake. The house creaked around her, filled with sounds of a life she did not yet understand. She thought of the miles she had traveled, the nights spent with little food, the cold that had bitten through thin blankets. She had reached a place of plenty, but it did not yet feel safe. Something about the rancher unsettled her: his sternness, his silence. The way his words seemed to carry more than what he said aloud. The villagers had whispered of him even before she had reached his gate. Stories of his wealth, his land, his temper. Some called him fair, others called him hard. A man like that was not easy to know, and she wondered if she ever truly would. Days passed, each one filled with work. She cooked, cleaned, learned the rhythm of the house. Her boy grew quieter, watching the ranch hands from the porch, studying their movements as though preparing himself for the day he would be asked to join them. The woman saw how the rancher sometimes watched her son too, not with cruelty, but with a thoughtfulness that was difficult to name. Yet there were questions left unspoken. Why had he truly let her stay? Was it only for the meals or something else? And what rules lay hidden, waiting to be broken without her knowing? The ranch was not a place for charity. Everything here had a purpose, a reason. She wondered what hers truly was. The longer she stayed, the more she felt the quiet walls pressing in with secrets she could not yet touch. At night, she sometimes heard doors opening down long halls, footsteps that stopped suddenly when she strained to listen. Once, passing through the study, she glimpsed the rancher bent over papers, his face shadowed, his expression grave, as if the weight of more than land and cattle sat on his shoulders. Still, he remained distant. His words to her were few, his gaze steady but guarded. Yet beneath it, she sensed something unsettled. As though her arrival had stirred a part of him he had long kept hidden. And though she worked with quiet diligence, the woman could not shake the feeling that her place here was not entirely of her own choosing. That perhaps, when she had knocked on that gate, she had opened more than just a door to survival. She had stepped into a story already unfolding, one whose ending she could not yet see. One evening, as the sky blazed orange with sunset and the ranch hands rode in weary from the fields, the rancher crossed the porch where she stood. He stopped beside her, his shadow long against the boards, and, for the first time, his voice carried not just command, but something heavier. "There are things you'll need to know," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Things about this land and about me. But not tonight." The words lingered, pulling at her curiosity, feeding her unease. She wanted to ask, but his silence was final. He turned, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his boots and the slow realization that whatever secrets bound this ranch were now bound to her as well. The boy tugged at her skirt, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mama, will we stay here forever?" She looked down at him, her heart caught between hope and fear, and found she could not answer. The wind picked up across the fields, carrying with it the distant sound of restless cattle, as though even the land itself waited for what was yet to come. The days slipped into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch wrapped itself around the woman and her boy, though it never felt entirely like it belonged to them. She rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and prepared meals that filled the long table, her hands steady even when her heart was not. The boy grew braver, venturing into the barn to watch the ranch hands work, sometimes offering to fetch water or carry small tools. Though his presence was tolerated, there were moments she caught uneasy glances from the men, so they questioned what place a child had in a house like this. The rancher himself remained a shadow both near and far. He was present, always, moving across the land with a quiet authority, but he spoke little. When he did, his words carried weight, like stones laid carefully, never wasted. She watched him from the kitchen window at times, striding across the fields, his coat brushing against tall grass, the men following his orders without hesitation. There was power in him, but also solitude, and that solitude made him difficult to read. Yet the woman began to notice the strain in the air of the ranch. At first, it was in small things, a sharp word exchanged between hands, a broken fence left unrepaired longer than it should have been, a horse restless in the night. Then came the whispers she overheard when men thought she was too far to hear. There had been trouble on the far edge of the land. Cattle gone missing, fences cut, riders seen in the night who did not belong. One evening, as she cleared the supper table, two of the ranch hands muttered about it near the door. "They're pushing closer," one said in a low voice. "Who? Behind it, they're not just rustlers, they want him to bleed." The other spat into the dirt. "You'd think a man with all this land would know how to keep it." The rancher's voice cut through the tension like a whip. "Mind your tongues and finish your work." The men fell silent, their heads lowering, but the woman caught the flicker of unease in their eyes. The rancher might command them, but even he could not erase their fear. Later that night, as she tucked her boy beneath a thin quilt in their small room, he whispered, "Mama, why are the men angry?" She smoothed his hair back gently. "It isn't anger, love. It's worry. Grown men don't like to admit when they're afraid." "Is it because of him?" the boy asked, his voice small. She paused. "Perhaps. Or maybe it's because of converging. It's because of what follows him." Her words hung heavier than she meant them to, and she kissed his brow, whispering for him to sleep. But long after his breathing steadied, she sat awake, listening to the restless winds outside, wondering what enemies might truly linger in the dark dot. In the following days, she began to see more of the rancher's burden. He rode out at dawn and returned long after dusk, his coat dusted and his eyes hard. Papers covered his study desk, maps, ledgers, letters he did not share. She once found him there, his head bowed over the lamp's glow, the lines of his face deep with weariness. For the briefest moment, he seemed less like the unshakable man of the land and more like someone who carried a weight too great for one person. But when he looked up and saw her, his expression shuddered closed again. Still, she began to piece together the shape of his conflict. His wealth and land were not shields, but targets. Rival ranchers eyed his cattle, his fences marked, borders too tempting to cross, and there were those who would take by night what they could not earn by day. The ranch was strong, but not untouchable, and those who envied it pressed harder each season. Amid this growing tension, the woman found herself caught in a struggle she had not expected, not against raiders or thieves, but within the walls of the house itself. Some of the staff treated her with quiet suspicion. The maid who had first shown her their room grew sharper with her words, correcting the smallest details as if waiting for her to fail. One of the older hands muttered that a stranger had no right to the kitchen, even among those who accepted her meals. There was an unspoken question of why she had been allowed to stay when so many others had not. And then there was the boy. He was quick to adapt, eager to learn, but his presence stirred whispers too. Some called him a distraction, others questioned his fatherless state. She bore their judgments in silence, but each word stung like a thorn, reminding her that though the rancher had opened his gate, the rest of the house had not fully done the same. One afternoon, as the boy lingered near the corral, one of the younger ranch hands crouched to speak to him. The woman, carrying laundry across the yard, caught the tail end of his words. "You keep close to your mama, lad. Not every man here wants you around." She froze, her heart tightening, when the boy ran back to her, smiling as though unaware. She set the basket down and stared after the young man. He tipped his hat at her, but the look in his eyes carried no warmth. She knew then that the struggle to belong was not only hers, but her son's as well. That night, she found herself alone on the porch. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like spilled grain. The rancher stepped out quietly, his boots barely creaking on the wood. For a long while he stood beside her in silence, watching the horizon. "You've heard them," he said at last. She glanced at him. "I have. They questioned me for letting you stay." His tone was flat, but his jaw was tight. "Then why did you?" she asked, the words escaping before she could hold them back. He turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment she thought he might answer. But instead, he said only, "Because I could." It was not enough, and yet it was more than she expected. She wanted to press further, to understand, but his silence was final. She realized then that whatever reasons drove him, they were tied to wounds and battles not yet spoken of. As the weeks deepened into colder nights, the tension around the ranch thickened. Men rode in pairs, rifles resting across their saddles. Dogs barked more often in the dark, as though sensing threats unseen. And always, the rancher carried himself with the same steady control, though the wear on his face grew sharper. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, the woman was startled awake by the sound of hooves pounding past the house. She rushed to the window, pulling her shawl close, and saw riders vanishing into the pale dawn, the rancher at their lead. Her boy stirred sleepily, asking what was wrong, but she could not answer. When the men returned hours later, they carried a broken fence rail and spoke in low, grim tones. Someone had cut the wires again, leaving cattle scattered across the far pasture. They had rounded most back, but the message was clear. Whoever opposed the rancher would not stop. That night, as the fire burned low in the hearth, the woman sat at the table with her hands folded tightly. The boy slept in the corner, his soft breathing the only comfort. The rancher entered quietly, his face shadowed, his shirt torn at the sleeve where a branch or worse had caught him. He sat across from her, the silence between them heavier than the air itself. "They'll keep coming," he said finally, "and those who work here will grow restless." Fear spreads quicker than fire. She met his eyes, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "And what of us? What place do we have in this when we are not part of your fight?" For the first time, his expression shifted, not anger, not sternness, but something almost human. "You stepped into it the moment you knocked at my gate." Her breath caught because she knew he was right. This was no longer just his battle. The land, the men, the dangers, they had bound themselves to her and her boy as surely as if she had been born to it. And yet, in that moment, She also understood that he carried secrets deeper than the cut fences and stolen cattle. Secrets that might explain why he had asked her to stay, why his eyes sometimes lingered with something unsaid, why the ranch itself felt haunted not only by enemies without, but by shadows within. She did not know how long she sat there. The weight of his words pressing on her, the flicker of the fire casting restless shapes across the walls. All she knew was that whatever path lay ahead, it was no longer one she could walk away from. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the darkness a horse cried out. The night pressed close, thick with threats unseen, and the woman knew that the true conflict, the one that would test them all, was only just beginning. The nights grew colder, and with them came a deeper unease that clung to the ranch like a shadow that could not be shaken. The woman felt it in the way the dogs barked longer at night, their hackles raised toward the unseen. She felt it in the men's eyes when they gathered around the fire after long hours in the saddle. Their voices low, their laughter forced. And most of all, she felt it in the silence of the rancher, whose steady composure never faltered, though the weight he carried seemed heavier by the day. The boy, though young, was not blind to the tension. He began asking questions she could not answer: why the men whispered about fences, why the rancher rode out at dawn with a rifle across his back, why the air seemed to thrum with something more dangerous than cattle or weather. She hushed him with soft words, but each time she did, she felt the sharp sting of fear coiled tighter in her chest. One evening, while she scrubbed the long wooden table after supper, two of the ranch hands lingered in the corner of the kitchen. They thought their voices were hushed enough, but she caught every word. "It isn't just rustlers," one said. "They're organized. Someone's driving them." "Maybe it's the neighboring spread," the other muttered. Jealousy runs deep when a man holds more land than all his neighbors combined. Or maybe it's bigger than that. Maybe it's old debts, old grudges. You can't build an empire this size without making enemies. Her hands slowed against the wood, her breath caught. She wanted to turn away, to block their words, but she knew too well the truth they carried. The rancher's silence, his guarded looks, his late rides into the night, they all pointed to a story that went far beyond missing cattle. Later that night, she stepped out onto the porch with her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. The stars stretched endless overhead, but their brightness did little to ease her unease. She heard boots behind her and turned to find the rancher standing there, his eyes searching hers. "You've been hearing too much," he said, his voice quiet but not unkind. "Your men don't hide their fears," she replied softly. "And neither do you. Not when you think no one is looking." His jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "This land is more than fences and cattle. It's a claim, a promise, and a threat to any who think they can take it. Men have been testing those lines for years. Lately, they've been testing harder." She met his gaze, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "And you mean to stand alone against them?" "I've always stood alone," he said, his words heavy as iron. She wanted to ask more, to press for truths he held locked away, but his expression told her she would get no further. And yet, in that moment, she saw something she had not before: the faintest flicker of vulnerability beneath the steel. The next morning, the boy came running into the kitchen, his cheeks flushed, his small hands clutching a scrap of cloth. "Mama, look what I found." She took it from him, frowning. The cloth was torn, rough, and marked with something: dark dirt, maybe, or dried blood. "Where did you find this?" she asked sharply. "By the fence," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Near the path where the horses go?" "I think someone dropped it." Her stomach tightened. She pressed the cloth into her apron pocket and hushed him, warning him not to speak of it to anyone. But when she was alone, she studied it again. was not the kind of fabric the ranch hands wore. It was rougher, patched, the kind that belonged to men who lived by stealing rather than working. It was proof, and yet it was also a warning. That night, the rancher noticed the tension in her face as she served supper. He waited until the men left, then asked quietly, "What weighs on you?" "Us." She hesitated, then pulled the cloth from her pocket. "My boy found this near the fence." His eyes darkened as he took it from her. He turned it over in his hand, his jaw set. "They're closer than I thought. What will you do?" she asked. He looked at her then, his gaze sharp as a blade. "What I must." And with that, he left the room, the cloth clenched in his fist. She stood there, her heart pounding, knowing she had handed him not only a clue, but a reason to act. In the days that followed, the ranch grew taut with preparation. Men checked their rifles, horses were saddled and kept ready, and the rancher gave orders with a sharper edge than before. The woman tried to keep to her duties, but she could not ignore the mounting storm. Every clatter of hooves in the night made her jump. Every howl of the wind felt like a warning. Then came the evening when everything shifted. She was in the kitchen, the boy dozing in a chair by the hearth, when the sound of shouting erupted. Outside, she rushed to the window and saw torches flickering at the edge of the field. Figures moved in the dark, too many to count. Their shouts carried on the wind. The rancher strode past the porch, rifle in hand, his men close behind. His voice cut through the chaos, calm but commanding. "Hold the line. Drive them back." The woman's breath caught as she clutched her boy close. She wanted to lock the door, to hide, but something inside her refused to cower. She stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the shadowed field. The sight chilled Herman, moving like ghosts, their faces hidden, their intent clear. This was no random raid. This was war. Gunfire cracked in the distance, the sound echoing off the hills. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the air thickened with smoke. The boy whimpered against her, and she held him close. Whispering soft words, she barely believed herself. The rancher glanced back once, his eyes meeting hers across the chaos. For a heartbeat, the distance between them closed, and she saw in him not just the leader of men, but a man carrying the fate of all who stood within his gates. Then he turned away, disappearing into the night with his rifle raised. Hours dragged on like days. The woman moved between the boy and the windows, her heart racing with every sound. Once, a figure rushed close to the house, and she grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, ready to strike. But the man fell before he reached the steps. The crack of the rancher's rifle, cutting him down. When silence finally fell, it was not peace, but a pause, heavy and uncertain. Smoke drifted across. The field's torches lay extinguished in the dirt, and the cries of wounded men echoed. Faintly, the rancher and his men returned, their faces grim, their clothes marked with dust and blood. The woman ran to the doorway, her boy clutching her hand, and for the first time she saw the rancher stagger. His sleeve was torn, his arm bleeding, though he brushed it off as nothing. The sight of him, strong yet wounded, sent a shiver through her. "They'll be back," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. Tonight was only the beginning. She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a storm cloud. This was not finished, not even close. The ranch had been tested, and though it still stood, the fight was far from over. That night, as she tended his wound in the lamplight, she saw the depth of his silence more clearly than ever. He winced as she wrapped the bandage tight, but he said nothing. Only when she finished did he meet her eyes. "You've brought more strength to this house than you know," he said quietly. "But strength alone may not be enough." Her breath caught, her hand trembling slightly as it rested against his arm. She wanted to ask what he meant, to press for truths he still withheld. but the words died on her lips. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows like a warning. The ranch stood strong for now, but the shadows gathering around it were thicker than ever. And as the fire burned low, the woman knew they were standing on the edge of something greater than survival. They were standing at the brink of a reckoning that would demand everything from them all. The night after the attack left the ranch hushed, as if the land itself held its breath. The woman barely slept, sitting by her boy's cot, her ears straining for every sound beyond the shuttered windows. When dawn finally broke, pale and uncertain, the air carried with it a quiet heaviness. The men moved slower that morning, their faces drawn, their voices rough. They had held the ranch, but it had cost them. And they all knew the fight was not finished. The rancher walked among his men, speaking little, checking the wounded, giving orders that carried no hint of hesitation. Even with the bandage wrapped tight around his arm, he did not falter. To see him was to see strength carved out of stone. But the woman had tended his wound and knew how much of that strength was sheer will. He did not allow himself weakness, not in front of those who followed. Him she kept to her duties, though her hands trembled at times. She baked bread, stirred stew, washed linens spotted with blood, and tried to keep her boy close. Yet her heart told her the time for silence was ending. Too much had gone unsaid between her and the rancher. Too many questions had been buried beneath his silence. That evening, as the last of the light faded over the hills, she found him alone in his study. Papers lay scattered across the desk maps of the land, accounts of the herd, letters marked with ink smudges. He leaned against the desk, staring at nothing, the firelight deepening the shadows on his face. "You've carried this alone for too long," she said quietly, stepping into the room. His eyes lifted to hers, steady but tired. "It's mine to carry." She shook her head. "Not anymore. If you expect us to stand here with you, then you must trust us with the truth." For a long moment, he said nothing. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, and she feared he might close himself off again. But then he exhaled, and his voice, when it came, was low but steady. "This land was my father's. He built it from nothing, and he made enemies doing it. There were men who thought he took more than his share, men who lost when he gained. When he died, they looked to me, waiting. For weakness, I gave them none, but it's never ended. Every fence cut, every herd scattered, not just theft, it's a reminder, a warning. They want me to fall, because if I fall, everything we built falls with me." The woman's throat tightened. "And you would stand alone forever, out of pride." He met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no wall between them, out of fear. "If I let anyone close, I give them something to use against me. That's how men like them win." Her eyes softened. "And yet, you let us in." The silence that followed was heavier than words. He did not deny it, and she knew then that her presence and her boys had broken through more than just the unlocked gates of the ranch. In the days that followed, the ranch began to mend. The men repaired fences, the cattle were gathered, and the wounded healed slowly. There was still unease, still the knowledge that more trouble might come, but the attack had changed something. The ranch hands no longer muttered about her in the corners. They ate her bread without question, accepted her place as though it had been written there all along. Even the maid who once bristled at her softened, bringing her extra linens, sharing small talk as they worked. Her boy grew bolder, running in the yard with the dogs, helping to carry buckets, even brushing down the horses with careful hands. The men began teaching him small tasks, no longer turning him away. He was no longer just her son. He was becoming part of the ranch, and the rancher he remained steady, but there was a change in him too. He spoke more often, not much, but enough, to show he was no longer locked in silence. At meals, he asked after her boy, nodded at her cooking, even shared brief words about the work of the day. They were small gestures, but they carried weight. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, he joined her on the porch. They stood side by side, watching the cattle graze, the land stretching endless before them. "You've given more to this place than I expected," he said. She turned to him, her voice quiet. "We only wanted a place to belong." He nodded slowly. "And perhaps you've found it." Her heart swelled at the words, though she did not answer. Belonging was not something given, it was something built, and she knew they were building it together. Day by day, the trouble on the land did not vanish overnight. There were still nights when riders were seen at the edges, still whispers of grudges that had not died. But the rancher was no longer standing alone. The men followed him with renewed loyalty. The woman stood beside him in the home, and her boy grew in the shadow of the ranch, learning its ways. Strength, she realized, did not only come from the man at the head, it came from all who stood behind him. Weeks later, when the air grew softer with spring, the woman found herself walking the edge of the fields with her boy. The grass was high, the fences strong, and the cattle grazed peacefully. The boy ran ahead, laughing, his arms wide like wings. She paused, watching him, the sound of his joy filling the wide open sky. The rancher rode up then, his horse slowing as he drew near. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the grass, and for a moment they simply watched the boy together. "He's strong," the rancher said. "He'll grow to be a good man." Her eyes softened. "He already is." The rancher glanced at her, and in his gaze she saw not just the weight of land and legacy, but the flicker of hope. Hope that perhaps his burden was no longer his alone, that perhaps the future held more than endless battles and silence. That night, as the house quieted and the boy slept soundly, the woman sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She thought of the road that had led her here, the hunger, the miles, the gate she had once stood before with nothing but desperation in her heart. Now that same gate no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a threshold she had crossed into a life she had not dared dream of. The ranch was not without its dangers, nor the man who led it without his flaws. But together they had faced the shadows, and together they would face what came next. She had found more than work, more than shelter. She had found a place where her boy could laugh again, where the walls no longer echoed with emptiness, where even the silence carried meaning as the fire crackled low. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for survival, but for the strength to endure, for the chance to belong, and for the unexpected bond that had grown in the heart of the ranch outside. The wind moved gently through the grass, no longer carrying threats, but promise. The land stretched wide and unbroken. The stars scattered bright above. And within that vastness, the woman, her boy, and the rancher found not just an ending, but the beginning of something new. The ranch still stood. The shadows had not claimed it. And for the first time in years, the woman believed that they would not.